All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know even 10:20 on the third day of YAPC is a bit early. So my name's Dave Rolski, and I'm going to be talking about tidying all the things and also linting all the things. But this was what fit on the meme generator image. So we're going to be talking about CodeTidyAll. What is it? Basically, it's a tool that lets you lint and prettify or tidy files in any language: JavaScript, Perl, JSON. I've used it for Go, and you could use it for other languages as well. So then the question you might ask is why? I don't know how many of you are like me and have severe coding OCD. I really cannot stand reading code that is slightly differently formatted in different spots, and I really get annoyed when I see things that I know are kind of bad practice. And in particular, I want to be able to spend my time when doing pull request reviews at work and so on. I want to focus on the kind of content of the code, not the structure of it. I don't want to be saying, hey, you shouldn't use each on a hash because of these problems. And I don't want this to just be like, yeah, it's great to write this down in a style guideline, but it's even better to enforce it programmatically via Git hooks and tests, and not have to discuss these things and just have people know this. And again, this applies to other languages as well. If you're using Go, you can use Go linters and have it tell people don't do these things, and then you end up with a higher quality code base, and you can spend your pull request energy focusing on things that really matter, like does this work? Of course, it doesn't work, but it looks really pretty. So. TidyAll is kind of plug-in and config-based. You don't have to really write any code for the most part. You would if you wanted to add a new formatter or a new linter. But other than that, it's just driven by the config. The config says what plugins to use and what files they apply to. And here's an example. So you can have global ignores. So we're going to ignore all of the things in this particular directory. And this is a real example from my daytime distribution. We're going to run Perl critic on anything that's a Perl file. We're going to run Perl tidy on anything that's a Perl file. And we can specify what arguments to pass to those things, to Perl tidy and Perl critic. So we can pass configs for those. We're going to sort lines in our stop words. That's for the spell checker. And then we're going to run test vars on all the modules. So does that make sense? Pretty straightforward? All right. And by the way, if something comes up where you have a question, just let me know. So this is kind of like the abstract version is you have global options, and then you have a plugin in brackets, and then you have per plugin options. And you can specify the same plugin multiple times if you want. So it has a whole bunch of different command line options I'll go into, but here's kind of the quick way to run it. We're going to run TidyAll, we're going to pass -a and -j. You can probably guess -j is jobs. It can run in parallel, and -a just means tidy everything, and where everything is whatever matches in our config file. So we'll apply our per plugin filters, which can have includes and excludes. We'll also apply our global excludes, and then whatever resulting files match, we'll have those plugins applied to them. So TidyAll caches things by default in a directory kind of in your project. By default, it'll be .tidyall.d. And if the file it is checking has not changed, then it will not rerun any checks. If the file has changed, of course, it will rerun all the appropriate tidiers and linters. You can force a run if you want, and occasionally you have to, because sometimes the caching can be incorrect. Notably, one case where the caching is incorrect is, let's say that a new version of Perl tidy comes out and it changes how it wants to format things. The cache is only looking at the modification time or the content of the file you're trying to tidy. It doesn't take into account the version of the plugins that were used. And there's kind of an open to-do to add that. Of course, that would be better, but it doesn't do that yet. You can also test your tidiness, and this is something I mentioned earlier. So I think it's great to have this as commit hooks, but of course, if you're using Git, as you know, you can't really force people to use commit hooks. You can yell at them to install them if they're not using them, but You really want to have this as part of your test suite, and this is kind of the very, very simplest version. So tidyall ships with test code tidyall. You import that, it exports a tidyall OK, and basically that will look for the config file in the root of your repository and apply all the tidiers and linters. And when I say apply, it actually runs in check mode, which means rather than actually tidying anything, it runs the tidier and checks if that would have changed the file, and that's considered a test failure. And for the linters, of course, it just runs them normally, and if the linter has any issues, that is also a failure. And there's a bunch of options you can pass that correspond to some of the things in the config, as well as some test-specific options if you like. Any questions so far? All right, so I mentioned it has caching. It actually has a kind of pluggable caching strategy implementation. And this was written at my last job. So one thing we wanted to do is we had a pretty large code base, and running tidyall against it took a long time. And one thing to note is that for the testing, you might want to tell it to always ignore the cache kind of by default, because for the test, you really want to double check. Again, if Perl tidy has been upgraded, you really want that to fail. But if you have a very large code base, that can take a while. So it would be nice if you could do some amount of caching, but maybe not the default, so you can have a plugin to do excuse me, different types of caching. And we had something that would save the results of tidy output between CI runs and then, save the kind of cache between CI runs and then would apply that to the next run, so we didn't have to run tidyall on things that had not changed between commits. And you can do that with implementing a caching strategy of your own. So it's got a whole bunch of CLI options, and I'll cover some of those. Things for caching, for how you select files, verbosity, all that stuff. So here's some basic ones. So we saw -A, that means just tidy everything that would apply. -G is anything that is modified or added according to Git. It won't check files that are new but haven't been added according to Git. So if you have untracked files, those are ignored. The first talking of the morning is always challenging. You can give it a path, and if that path is a directory, you're going to want to give it -R. That means recursively. And you can also just give it a path to a single file and have it tidy that. I mentioned it has parallelism, so if you give it -J, it will run things in parallel. You're going to want to do that if you have a lot of files, because it's kind of slow. When I say it's slow, really it's the tidiers and linters that are slow. Perl Critic and Perl Tidy are not the fastest things. No offense intended. It's just like they're complex. In particular, Perl Critic is using PPI, which is a pure Perl or mostly pure Perl-based parser of Perl, and it's not that fast. So you can run in parallel. You need to, I believe, install Parallel Fork Manager off CPAN as an optional dependency to get this to work, and then it will just fork off as many jobs as you want, and this actually speeds it up by quite a bit. So especially, again, for CI, you're going to want to be able to do this. Again, when you call test code tidyall, or you call it tidyall OK, you can tell it how many jobs you want, because the faster your CI is, the better. You can disable caching, again, if you have an issue where, for example, Perl Tidy has been updated, and so the cache is kind of invalid, but tidyall doesn't know that yet. You can just pass no cache, and it will ignore the cache. You can also just wipe the directory entirely. That's totally fine. It's a cache directory. And of course, I mentioned Git hooks, so it has some help for writing Git hooks. So it has helper modules for pre-commit, and another one that I never use, it might be pre-push. I always just use pre-commit. So this is, again, the very simplest version of a Git hook that runs tidyall. You just use code tidyall git pre-commit, and you call check as a class method on that package, and it will look for things that are about to be committed. Now, the one thing it doesn't, no, actually, I take it back. It by default will stash changes that are not about to be committed, and then just check what's left, and then unstash it. This is a little buggy, to be honest. One thing I've noticed is sometimes it can blow up mid-check, and then you end up pushing more and more things onto the stash every time you run your commit hook. And then if you're like me and you have like a command line indicator of how many things are in your stash, you're like, why is this getting bigger and bigger? And then you look at it and it's just like the last changes you tried to commit. Anyway, don't worry about it too much. It works well enough. Again, patches welcome, right? So it's really handy, but you can't force people to use it. So you're also going to want to run the tests via CI. So there's a whole bunch of plugins, but one I just want to highlight first is there's this generic transformer and validator plugins. So the original way things worked with tidyall was to add a new linter or add a new tidier. You had to write a new Perl class that knew how to do the thing in question. So if you wanted to add one for, let's say, Go format, you had to write a plugin called Go format. I mean, you call it whatever you want, and then it would know how to call out to the Go format executable and know, okay, if it exits with 0, it's okay. If it exits with 1, it's not, and so on. And what I realized as we wrote more plugins was this is all very similar. By the way, I forgot to mention this earlier, and since it's on my mind, I'm just going to say this. I didn't create tidyall. It was created by a guy named John Swartz. He's also the guy who created Mason many years ago. I've been maintaining it for quite some time, but I do want to give credit where it's due before I forget, and I'll add that to my slides. All right, so back to the generic transformers and validators. So yeah, it used to be you just had to like write these custom plugins, but especially for things that aren't Perl where you're just shelling out and calling some executable, they're basically all the same plugin, okay? They have kind of general features. They have the executable you're going to run, kind of arguments you need to pass, how you specify the files on the command line that you want it to execute against, and then what exit codes are okay or not okay. And that's it. So I wrote these generic plugins that let you actually specify all that via config. So now we don't need to write more and more plugins that are nearly identical and upload them to CPAN and have people have to download them just to run yet another executable from another language. Instead, you can just use this. So this kind of greatly simplifies interactions with tidyall, I think. That said, we have a bunch of plugins that already exist. In particular, writing a plugin can be faster if it's something in Perl and you don't need to spawn a new process. So for example, the Perl Tidy plugin can do it all in the same process as tidyall because Perl Tidy has an API that you can use against the things you're tidying as opposed to calling the Perl Tidy executable. So that is a little faster. So that is an option, again, for Perl stuff. But for anything else, it really isn't, unless you have like a Go tidier that you wrote in Perl. And why? That's bizarre. Generally, the language itself has a better ecosystem than what you'll find in Perl. So lots of plugins. I mentioned Perl Tidy and Perl Critic. Of course, I use those on basically everything. We have JSON tidiers, JS hint and JS lint, line sorting, which you saw earlier as well, test vars you saw earlier as well, Go format and Go vet. Like I said, it's easy to write more. You can also use that generic transformer and validator to do it even more easily. Okay, so I know this talk is about tidyall, but now I'm going to talk about something totally different. So I'm writing this new replacement for tidyall. Yeah, this is a story as old as programming. Programmer has a tool, programmer uses tool, programmer says, I can write a better tool, programmer starts writing new tool, programmer has new tool, programmer says, I can do better. Okay, yes, it's an endless recursive loop. So I'm writing a new tool. It's called Precious because it's one code quality tool to rule them all. And so why am I doing this? First of all, I wanted to learn Rust, so I'm writing it in Rust, which is much harder than writing this in Perl. I could have written this in Perl and been done with it weeks, months ago. But learning Rust is fun. I don't know if any of you went to Andrew's talk about Rust before. It's just a really cool language. And the other thing is tidyall has a core design issue that makes it not play well with Go, which is that tidyall, like through and through, is all about files. And it's really hard to get it to not operate on a per file basis, it would require like just this massive restructuring of the code base. But how many of you have done any Go? Few? Okay, so if you have, you know that in Go, a package is a directory of files. Go does not care about files per se. It cares about the package, and particularly when you're talking about linting, which involves reading a package and generating an AST and doing stuff on that, it operates on a directory, not on a file. So it doesn't make sense to actually talk about linting Go files. You can only lint Go packages. Now for formatting, for tidying, yes, that operates on files. But that fundamental mismatch actually makes it really hard to do certain things with Go with tidyall. So I wanted to write something new that was able to operate either on files or directories on a kind of per plugin basis. And so I ended up working on this. If you're curious and want to follow the progress, it's at that URL. It somewhat works now, but there's just a bunch to do to make it even close to as capable as tidyall. One thing that is different is there's no notion of plugin classes or anything like that. It's all done through that generic validator and transformer, the idea I talked about before. And then the other thing that I hope to eventually add is support for language LSP, the LSP protocol, language server protocol, which is basically a protocol for kind of code hinting, code linting, code tidying that was originally built for editors. But if you have a language server protocol server, like for a language, there's no reason a tool like this couldn't talk to it. And that would be a lot more efficient than spawning new processes. But I have found, even running this and spawning Perl tidy and Perl critic over and over, if I do it in parallel, it's just fine because, the operating system is really good about knowing, okay, I just ran Perl critic and it still has all that stuff in memory. So it actually works out okay. So I will certainly accept patches to tidyall. I'm not going to revise all of the internals to make it play well with Go, especially when I could bang my head against Rust endlessly. It's a fun language, but it's a very challenging language. All right, we have 4 minutes left. Any questions? Stunned silence. Disappointed silence. Mocking silence. I don't know what it is. Questions? Anything? Yes?
If you wanted to use this for, say, something like Puppet modules or typical config files where you had your own in-house rules, could you create some kind of a plugin to do that?
Okay, so the question was, say you wanted to use this for, say, something like Puppet config files and you have your own in-house rules. How would you do that? So yes, you absolutely can do that. And there's a couple different ways. One, you could write a new plugin class. You could call it My House Puppet Lint or whatever. It doesn't really matter. You just put it under code tidyall plugin anywhere in that namespace, and then you can reference it by the short name in the config. So, for example, we saw earlier, much earlier, like when some plugin is a Perl module called code tidyall plugin, some plugin. So you could do it that way. You could use the generic transformer. And as far as how you specify kind of custom things, so you see here for Perl critic and Perl tidy, I have this argv thing, and it's actually referring to this $root. That's the root of your repository. Or really the root of essentially it's where the tidyall config file lives. So if you have your tidyall.ini in the same directory as your Perl critic RC and Perl tidy RC, it's really easy to refer to them. I mean, even if it's a subdirectory, it'll work as well. So you can pass additional arguments to whatever the plugin is, however the plugin accepts it. And again, with the generic validator plugin, it takes argv, and you would pass the path to whatever custom config you have. So basically all the tidiers work that way that accept some sort of extra config. They take additional options one way or another. So like somehow that is possible. So anything you create, it will also be possible the same way. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Well, I guess I want to just get one level deeper. How would you start setting up those rules for the grammars, I suppose?
Oh, okay. So the question was like, how would you actually write the tidier or the linter? Oh, that's a very different question. That's a hard question to answer because, okay, so essentially you need something that can parse the language or config file in question and then turn it into something to which you can apply rules if it's a linter typically for programming languages, you want to build an AST, although actually PPI doesn't build an AST exactly. If you saw Sawyer's talk yesterday, he talked about ASTs versus documents. So you need like an AST builder or some sort of document parser that gives you the capability of analyzing it. That's hard. I mean, if you look at PPI, it's really like there's an enormous amount of code that goes into this. It's a very hard endeavor. I haven't looked at Puppet in many years, and I don't remember how complicated it is. I know for something like Ansible, which is all YAML, it would actually be fairly easy, right? You could start with a YAML parser, and then Ansible has kind of more structure than YAML in that there are kind of known keys and so on.
To that end, then, say we were doing Ansible instead of Puppet.
So if you're doing Ansible, yeah, you'd start with a YAML parser and then have some sort of system of rules. Again, you could look at Perl Critic for inspiration. Its use of PPI and how it kind of does that stuff, I think, is a good way to understand. But the real answer is it's complicated.
The real answer is no.
No, it's absolutely doable. It's just a fair bit of work. Okay, so he gave me the done sign, but is there one more question that's quick? All right, so well, if not, then I will just say, oh, I don't have a slide that says thank you, but thank you for coming.